In our town, the mornings begin with the sound of screen doors and sparrows. You can tell the time by the church bell and the smell of yeast from the bakery. People know whose porch light stayed on too late and whose garden needs rain. It's a small life, a good one, if you don't mind the way stories travel quicker than wind. My name doesn't matter as much as the way I lived. Quietly, carefully, with a kettle that sang at 6 every morning and a porch swing that knew the weight of my worry. I was a grandmother of one, Eli, who kept his toy trucks in a tin bread box and never left without his red cap. He'd say, "Nana, count how many mailboxes from here to the store," and we'd make a game of it, like numbers could keep life obedient. It's strange which days the soul bookmarks. For me, it was a Tuesday. The light came in thin through lace curtains. The floor needed sweeping. I was tracing yesterday's coffee ring on the table with my thumb when the clinic called. "Nothing urgent," the secretary said, "but the nurse practitioner wants to go over Eli's cough and some paperwork we're missing." Paperwork. In this town, that word carries more weight than thunder. I set the receiver down and looked at the kettle. It hadn't started to sing yet. "Eli," I called into the hallway, "bring your cap. We're going to the clinic." He appeared with his backpack hanging off one shoulder like a story that never quite sits right. "Do I get a lollipop if I don't cough on the nurse?" he asked, grinning. "2," I said, because I believed in rewarding courage where I could. On the way, the road curled past fields already cut into tidy lines, the stubble shining in the low sun. A stray flyer flapped on the telephone pole. The church potluck had been moved to Saturday, a detail that matters to people who find safety in calendars. I'm one of those people. I liked knowing what came next. Tell me in the comments, are you like that too? Do you cling to lists and recipes when your heart feels too complicated? At the clinic, the nurse looked young enough to be Eli's babysitter. She checked his chest with a cold stethoscope and made small talk about the school fair. Then she tilted her head at me. "We just need to confirm guardianship for our files," she said, sliding a clipboard across the counter. "Parent or legal guardian signature." "His mother's working late," I said, reflexively. The sentence felt practiced, a path my mouth knew by heart. "I'll sign for now." She pointed to a line. "It needs to match what we have on record," she said, polite but firm, like someone trained to be kind while guarding a door. When I put pen to paper, I wrote my name the way I always do, looping the first letter, slowing down for the last. The ink bled slightly into the cheap pulp, a small imperfection that felt somehow personal. The nurse's smile thinned. I'm sorry," she said, looking between me and the folder. "We have you listed as, well," she lowered her voice, "as the mother." I laughed, because sometimes shock uses humor as a small boat. "He's my grandson," I said gently. "His mother is my daughter." The nurse blinked, then tapped the file again, this time with a seriousness that crisped the air around us. "Our system shows a finalized adoption. Mother of record, you." The waiting room clock made a sound like a shoe click every second. I felt suddenly aware of the linoleum, the smell of alcohol swabs, the child's drawing taped crooked on the wall, houses with triangles for roofs, and a sun that always smiles too big. "May I see?" I asked. She slid the manila folder toward me. Inside, a photocopied birth certificate with the hospital crest, a court stamp, a date that belonged to a winter I remember for ice and fear, and the way my daughter stopped speaking and started slamming doors. My name, in print, where it should not have been. Finalized 4 months after Eli was born. Petition signed by my late husband. Consent by the biological mother, my daughter. Scribbled smaller than the kind of apology that can be typed. I heard Eli coughing, a small, persistent sound like a woodpecker. He had found the lollipop jar with his eyes and was being patient because I'd taught him to be. Tell me, if you're still here, have you ever read a sentence that moved the furniture inside you? The nurse must have seen the heat drain from my face. She said softly, "We see this sometimes. Kinship adoptions. Families help each other." She meant well. She meant ordinary. But it was not ordinary to discover your life had been edited without you learning the new lines. I took the folder and thanked her, because manners are a language in themselves. On the drive home, the world looked the same: the grocery store with the hand-painted sign, the barber shop with one chair. But I understood suddenly how a stage can look cozy, even as the trap door loosens under your feet.
At home, Eli ran out back to count dragonflies along the fence. I set the folder on the kitchen table and made tea on instinct. Tea is my answer to grief and gossip both. Steam rose like the past trying to speak. I told myself I needed to wait for my daughter, ask calmly, make room for the answer. But patience and panic are cousins. They arrive together and crowd the doorway. The front door opened on a swirl of perfume and evening air. My daughter, hair pulled back, eyes lined darker than her soul needed. "How was the clinic?" she asked, already moving toward the sink as if dishes could be a shield. "Did he behave?" "Like a prince," I said, handing her a cup. "They needed paperwork." "Always with the paperwork," she muttered, rolling her eyes. I slid the folder closer. They had more than paperwork. She didn't touch it. "Mom," she said, nostrils flaring, in a way I remembered from her teenage years, "please don't start." "I'm not starting," I said, and heard the tremble in my voice like an old screen door that never quite closes. "I'm trying to catch up." She stared at me then, and something in her softened and snapped at the same time. "We did what we had to," she said, looking away. "When he was born, I couldn't. You knew that." Her mascara had smudged in the corner, a bruise of ink. "He needed stability. The lawyer said this would protect him, and you, and me." "And you didn't tell me," I said, the sentence light and heavy, all at once. Her jaw worked. "You would have said no." Silence came down like snow. Not loud, not dramatic. It just changed the way everything sounded. If you've ever stayed quiet to keep the peace, tell me below, did it save you or just delay the storm? When she left, because leaving is sometimes the only thing a person can figure out how to do, I stood with my palm flat on the folder. The paper felt warm from where it had borrowed my body heat. My husband's name, God rest him, sat on the page like a small, neat betrayal. He'd signed when I wasn't looking. He'd made me a mother again without telling me I had become one. I thought of the winter Eli was born, how my daughter disappeared for a week to visit a friend, how my husband came home with formula and a soft blue blanket and said the baby would stay a while. I'd prayed over that child with the reverence of borrowed things. I didn't know I was praying over mine. The kettle clicked off. The house settled. The day dimmed itself into that cushion of time between dinner and the news, where everything takes a breath. I went to Eli's room and sat on the edge of his bed. He'd fallen asleep with a crayon still in his fist, blue smudges on his fingers like he tried to hold the sky. He breathed the way children breathe when they trust the world to keep spinning. I tucked his blanket to his chin and felt it, the rush and ache, the ridiculous flood of love that makes nonsense of law and blood and names. Mother is a verb before it's a noun. Tomorrow, I whispered to the dim room, we'll get your cough sorted. I wanted to make a promise I could keep. On my way back down the hall, I stopped at the cedar chest under the window. Inside was a life in folded form, the christening gown every baby in our family wore, the quilt my grandmother made from old aprons, and a shoebox of letters tied with a ribbon that used to be red. I didn't know what I was looking for until I found it, a hospital bracelet from years ago with my daughter's name, a date, a weight. Beside it, another bracelet, smaller, nameless, because in those days, newborns were often tagged baby boy before the ink caught up to their existence. I held the tiny circle of plastic up to the window. The porch light outside cast a thin halo through it. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard eased with temperature. In small towns, even wood learns to breathe with you. Tell me, if you're still with me, have you ever touched an object and felt it touch you back? I put the bracelets beside the folder on the kitchen table, like laying two versions of truth on the same cloth. The clock over the stove clicked its sure, indifferent math. 60 beats a minute, 60 minutes an hour, and somewhere between 7 and 8, I became the mother of a boy who called me Nana his whole life. What do you do with a word that rearranges your bones? You hold it like a bird you're afraid to crush and afraid to lose. I washed the cups, wiped the counter, straightened the salt and pepper as if order could be summoned by small obediences. Then I wrote a list on the back of an envelope. Clinic follow-up, antibiotic. Talk to Pastor Ruth about paperwork, prayer, words for what this is. Call county records in the morning, ask for Mrs. Leary. Find the lawyer's name on the adoption stamp. Buy cough drops, cherry, bread, milk, eggs. In the early 2000s, no one I knew was taking DNA tests in living rooms. Truth still arrived on letterhead. The fax machine at the church office had a temper. People trusted stamps more than screens. I sat with that, grateful in a strange way that this revelation was printed, not pixelated. Paper can be folded, dated, tucked into a Bible. Screens glare. Paper waits. I wrote a second list then, quieter. Forgive my husband, slowly, with help. Do not shame my daughter in public. Keep Eli's world steady. No sudden storms. Learn how to be a mother again at 62. Pray. Sleep. Through the lace, the streetlight painted the table in polite squares. The art smelt faintly of cut grass and rain from earlier. Somewhere far off, a train sent out a lonely sound that always made me feel both small and accompanied. I thought of calling someone, my friend Hattie, the one who knows how to listen, the pastor who knows how to wrap scripture around a wound without tying it too tight. But some stories must be said first to a room that knows your footsteps. So I spoke it to the quiet. My grandson is my son. The word sounded rounder out loud, like a bell that had been waiting for a hand. I won't pretend I didn't feel betrayed, by my husband most of all. He should have told me. He should have sat with me and sorted the fear from the hope and signed with my hand on his. That is what marriage is, the joining of signatures and breathing. But he is gone, and the dead don't answer why. As for my daughter, I remembered her at 17, ashamed of everything, including breathing, and I softened. Sometimes the young set fires to keep warm, not knowing what they're burning. Upstairs, the house sighed again. Houses do that when they have agreed to hold one more secret. Before bed, I took the folder to the porch. The night had gathered itself close. I could hear the creek gossiping over stones, frogs entering their choir practice. I lit a candle in the old blue jar we use when the power goes out. The flame made the paper glow from beneath, like truth lit by its own source. Lord, I said, because prayer is my language when facts outrun my courage. Make me gentle. Make me exact. Let me love him in a way that doesn't make him carry the weight of our adult decisions. The candle flickered, as if a small wind had come by to say it heard me. If you're listening, tell me, when the people you love make choices that change your name, how do you forgive the history without pretending it didn't happen? I blew the candle out and watched the smoke braid itself into the night. The porch swing creaked, then settled. Behind me, the screen door clicked like a period at the end of a sentence that refuses to be the last.
I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the armchair by the window, the folder on my lap, the house dark, but not quiet. The refrigerator hummed its steady prayer, and the clock on the wall counted my heartbeat like it was keeping score. Sometimes, silence is louder than confession. By dawn, I decided to do what I've always done: face the day like it was ordinary. I made coffee, fed the stray cat that visits my porch, and packed Eli's lunch like it was any other morning. Peanut butter, apple slices, a small note tucked inside that said, "Be kind." But as he ran down the driveway with his backpack bouncing, I felt something inside me tear, softly, silently, like an old hymn coming loose. He was mine, and he didn't know. The first person I told wasn't my daughter. It was Pastor Ruth. I drove to the church after dropping Eli at school. The sanctuary smelled of wax and wood polish. Dust floated through sunlight like it was listening. She saw me standing at the door and opened her arms the way only people who know your history can. "Margaret, what's broken?" I didn't have the right words, so I handed her the folder. She read, lips moving, eyes slowing. When she looked up, she wasn't shocked, just sad. The kind of sadness that has lived long enough to recognize itself. "Secrets," she said quietly, "have long legs. They walk through generations until someone decides to sit them down." I laughed through a tear. Well, looks like it sat right in my lap. We talked for a long while about forgiveness, about motherhood, about how love can get tangled when fear does the tying. She told me something I've never forgotten. "Margaret, truth doesn't destroy families. It just rearranges them into what they were always meant to be." I nodded, though I didn't feel ready to test that theory. Because rearranging meant reopening wounds I had spent years learning to ignore. When I got home, I found my daughter already there, sitting at the kitchen table, eyes red, hair undone. The folder was still where I'd left it, but now it was open. She'd been reading it again. "Mom," she whispered, "I didn't sleep either." She rubbed her temples. "I was 17, you remember. I thought I'd ruined everything. Dad said if we filed the papers, it'd fix it, that we could make it right. You were so proud of me, and I didn't want you to know what I had done." "What you had done?" I repeated, soft but shaking. "What you did was bring a child into the world. That isn't shame." She covered her face with her hands. "I wasn't ready to be a mother. You were. You always were. I thought if you raised him, he'd have a chance. I thought love could cover the lie." Tell me in the comments. Have you ever lied because you thought it would protect someone you loved? We sat there for what felt like hours. No yelling, no slamming, just two women trying to stitch truth back into the fabric of their lives. Finally, she said. Do you hate me?
No, I whispered, but I wish you trusted me enough to let me help without pretending. Her eyes filled. You were always the strong one, Mom. I didn't want you to see how weak I was. Strength, I said, isn't hiding the storm. It's learning to walk through it and still set the table. That afternoon, I drove past the school and saw Eli on the playground. He was chasing another boy, laughter spilling out of him like sunlight, his red cap crooked, his knees grass-stained. For a moment, the whole truth didn't matter. He was loved. He was safe. But then he turned, waved at me through the fence, and yelled, "Hi, Nana!" And I felt something ache behind my ribs, the space between what I was and what I could never say. I waved back, smiling, but tears stung my eyes. He deserved the truth one day, but not now. Not while he was still spelling words like world with an extra E. That night, I opened my husband's old tool chest. Inside, beneath a layer of newspaper and rust, was a small notebook bound in leather. His handwriting, the slanted kind men used to learn in school, filled every line. I found entries dated from the year Eli was born. Mary is breaking. I told her we'd fix this somehow. Margaret can raise the baby. She already loves him like her own. She doesn't need to know the details. The Lord forgives, but Margaret deserves peace. Peace. He'd written it like it was something he could wrap and hand to me. I sat there, hands trembling, and whispered, "You meant well, but you left me living in half a truth. If you're still here, tell me, have you ever been loved by someone who made decisions for you instead of with you?" When I finished reading, I closed the notebook gently and pressed it to my chest. There were no villains here, just people trying to love the best way they knew, clumsily, fearfully, and wrong in all the right ways. That night, I prayed again, not for answers this time, but for grace. Enough grace to hold both gratitude and grief in the same palm. I whispered, "Lord, let me be what he needs, no matter what name he calls me." The house exhaled. The clock clicked on. The night was quiet enough to hear forgiveness begin.
The next morning, I woke before the sun. The sky was that pale gray blue that always reminds me of a promise not yet kept. I made coffee, buttered 2 slices of toast, and sat at the table, staring at the folder again. The papers didn't look as heavy as they felt. I'd lived through death, debt, and long winters, but nothing prepared me for the quiet weight of truth. It doesn't crash like thunder. It lingers like fog. I told myself I needed to move forward, not just sit and ache. So I began to gather pieces of what this new life meant. Birth certificates, family photos, little notes my husband had left behind. I was searching for something, though I couldn't name what. Maybe proof that I hadn't imagined the love between us, even if it was built on lies. A few days later, Ruth came by with pie and gentle eyes, as she always did when she knew words might break before they'd heal. She sat at the kitchen table, folded her hands, and said, "What are you going to do, Margaret?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to tell him. The other part wants to protect him from ever needing to know." She nodded slowly. "Maybe it's not about choosing one or the other. Maybe it's about when and how." I thought about that for a long time. Timing. That's what small towns understand best. Everything has its season. Later that week, I got a call from the school. Eli had fallen on the playground. Just a scrape, but he'd wanted me, not his mom. They said he cried for his Nana. When I arrived, he ran into my arms so hard I nearly dropped my purse.
His knees were scraped and tears still clung to his lashes, but he looked up at me with the kind of trust that humbles you. "You came," he whispered. "Always, always, sweetheart." And in that one word, always, I understood something. It didn't matter what the paperwork said. He had already chosen who I was. Tell me in the comments, have you ever realized that love doesn't care about titles, only presence? That night, I sat with my daughter again. The anger between us had cooled into something softer, like the air after rain. She said, "I think you should tell him one day. Not now, but someday." I nodded. Someday when he's old enough to understand that none of this was his fault. She smiled sadly. Maybe that's what motherhood really is, learning which truths to hold back until love is ready to carry them. There was no more blame left between us, only shared fatigue. I reached across the table and took her hand. I said, "We both did what we thought was right." She squeezed back, and somehow he still turned out good. A week later, I went to the courthouse in town, the same building where my husband had signed those papers all those years ago. The clerk was new, younger, probably born the same year my daughter was sneaking out to dances. "I like to request a certified copy of a birth record." I slid the reference number across the counter.
He typed a few keys, looked at the screen, and said, "You're listed as the mother, ma'am." I nodded. "Yes, I just need to see the full record." When he printed it, the paper was warm, as if it still remembered being part of a tree. There it was again. My name, her signature, the stamp that made fiction into law. But there was something else at the bottom. A handwritten note in the margin, barely legible. Per court request. Original certificate sealed. Reason, family protection. Family protection. The phrase felt like both a wound and a prayer. On my way out, I passed the town square, kids playing near the fountain, an old man feeding pigeons, and a young mother pushing a stroller. Life going on, unbothered by other people's buried truths. I sat on the bench and watched the sunlight move across the courthouse steps, and for the first time since that day at the clinic, I didn't feel angry. I just felt older, wiser, maybe, or just tired enough to be kind. He died. If Margaret ever finds out, I hope she forgives me. I didn't do it to hide her from truth. I did it to give her something pure to love. I closed the book and whispered, "I forgive you." And I meant it. Not because it erased the pain, but because I didn't want that pain anymore. If you're still listening, tell me, do you believe forgiveness is something we give or something we finally allow ourselves to feel? That night, the sky turned the color of old lavender. I made tea the same way I did every night and sat by the window. Eli was in his room humming to himself while building something out of toy blocks. I realized then, life had already decided what I was. Not mother, not grandmother, but keeper. Keeper of peace. Keeper of the story. And one day, when he had grown enough to see the world for what it is, imperfect, tender, and full of mistakes that somehow still make families, I would tell him everything. Not to shock him, not to confess, but to show him what love looks like when it refuses to die, even under layers of silence. The summer after I found out, time seemed to soften its edges. Days unfolded slow and forgiving.
the kind of days where the air smells like grass and memory. Eli grew taller. His front teeth came in uneven, his laugh louder, his world still perfectly small. And me, I learned to live with the secret that no longer hurt, just hummed quietly like a hymn I knew by heart. I didn't need to fix the past anymore. I just needed to tend to the present. Every Sunday, we'd walk to the lake after church. He'd throw pebbles, trying to skip them across the water. I'd sit on the bench, watching the ripples fade, and thinking about how life does the same. Disturbance, then stillness. One afternoon, he sat beside me, pulling grass apart in little strands. "Nana," he said, "how come you always say love doesn't end? It just changes shape." I smiled, because that's what it does, sweetheart. Sometimes it's a hug, sometimes it's a memory, and sometimes it's a secret you keep safe until it's ready to breathe. He nodded, pretending to understand, and went back to his pebbles. But I think part of him did understand, in the way children sense truths before they have words for them. Tell me in the comments, have you ever carried a truth you weren't ready to speak, but knew someday you'd have to? By fall, my daughter and I had grown close again. We started baking together on weekends, the way we used to before everything went quiet between us. She'd talk about work, I'd talk about Eli, and sometimes we'd talk about him, my husband. Not with anger anymore, with gratitude for the parts of him that were good and forgiveness for the parts that weren't. One evening as we kneaded dough, she looked at me and said, "Mom, I've thought about telling him when he's older, about everything." I nodded. "When he's ready, and when you can tell it without shame." She smiled. "I think I'm almost there." That's when I knew. Forgiveness had done its quiet work. The years after that moved in gentle circles. Eli's cough went away. He started writing stories at school about the bravest woman he knew. His teacher said they were always about an old lady who lived by the lake and could make any hurt go away. He never used the word mother. He didn't need to. He just wrote, "She's mine." If you're still here, tell me, do you think the people we love ever really stop being ours, even when life changes the titles? When he turned 18, he asked me to sit with him by the porch one night. The air was warm and the stars looked like they'd been strung just for us. He was quiet for a while, then said softly, "Mom told me everything." My heart stopped, not from fear, but from the weight of arrival. I looked at him, at the young man who had once fit in the crook of my arm. "And how do you feel?" I asked. He smiled. "Loved. Twice." I didn't realize I was crying until he leaned over and wiped my cheek with his thumb, the same way I'd done for him when he was small. He said, "You were my nana when I needed a grandmother. You're my mother when I needed one most. You don't have to pick." And just like that, everything made sense. The pain, the silence, the paperwork, the years of wondering, they had all been leading here. Not to an ending, but to peace. That night, after he went to bed, I stepped outside. The lake was still, the moonlight brushing its silver. I whispered into the dark, "Thank you, Lord, for giving me 2 chances to love the same soul." A breeze moved through the trees like an answer. I felt my husband somewhere in that wind, forgiven, remembered, and gone. Now, years later, when people in town ask about Eli, I smile and say, "He's doing well. He's mine." And I mean it in every way that matters. Sometimes love doesn't follow rules. Sometimes it bends them so that grace can fit through. So if you're listening right now,
If the past ever returned to your doorstep wearing a name you didn't expect, don't run from it. It may just be life giving you back something you lost too soon. Because here on True Life Stories, we don't just tell stories, we remember them. Subscribe, stay with us, and help the silence end one true story at a time.